Today's topic is major connectors. What is major connector? Major connector is the part of the major connector is the part of the RPD that connect the component on one side of the arch to the component on the opposite side of the arch. Here in this picture, this is the major connector, and the major connector is the part of the RPD. This is the R. All the three pictures represent the RPDs, and this is the part of the this is the major connector, which is the part of the RPD that connect component on one side of the arch to the component on the opposite side of the arch. The major connector is the part of the RPD. This is the major connector. It is the part of the RPD that connect the component on one side of the arch to the component on the other side of the or the opposite side of the arch. And all the component attach directly or indirectly to the major connector. What are the other components of the RPD? Like other component of the RPDs like minor connector, direct retainers, indirect retainers, and the rest seat. All other components are directly or indirectly connect to the major connector. This is the major connector which connect all other component or parts of the RPD. So here in this picture, this is the major connector here. This is the major connector which connect the component on one side of the arch to the component on the other side of the arch, and all the component attached directly or indirectly to the major connector. And here in this picture, this is the major connector. This is the major connector, and it is the part of the RPD that connect the component on one side of the arch to the component on the opposite side of the arch. And all component attach directly or indirectly to the major connector. Now the rules. What are the rules for using the major connector? Rules are, it should be rigid. This is the major connector and it should be rigid. First rule is it should be rigid. And in the upper arch or in the maxillary arch, all the three are maxillary major connector. The border of the major connector must be no closer than 6 mm to gingival crevice. It means distance from the border of the major connector. This is the border of the major connector. And this is the gingival crevice. This is the gingival crevice. This distance from the border of the major connector and gingival crevice, it should be no closer than 6 mm. This distance should be 6 mm for the maxillary arch. In the upper arch, the border of the major connector, this is the border of the major connector, and the gingival crevice, this is the gingival crevice, this distance should be 6 mm. This distance. This is the border of the major connector and this is the gingival crevice. This distance should be 6 mm in the maxillary arch. And in the mandibular arch, this distance, that is distance in the mandibular arch, this distance should be 3 mm, no closer than 3 mm to the gingival crevice of the teeth. And next point, there should be a minimum vertical space of 8 mm between the tissue of the floor of the mouth and the gingival margin of the teeth to use a lingual bar. See this picture. There should be a minimum vertical space of 8 mm. This is the mandible. In the mandible, if we have to use the lingual bar is the mandibular major connector. If we have to use the lingual bar, the minimum vertical space of 8 mm between the tissue of floor of the mouth. This is the tissue of floor of the mouth. This is the tissue of floor of the mouth. And the gingival margins of the teeth. This is the gingival margin of the teeth. This distance should be 8 mm if we are using the lingual bar as a major connector. In the mandible, the minimum vertical space of 8 mm between the tissue of floor of the mouth. This is the floor of the mouth. And the gingival margin of the teeth. This is the gingival margin of the teeth. This distance should be 8 mm. If we have to use the lingual bar as a major connector. This is the lingual bar. This is the lingual bar. If we have to use the lingual bar as a major connector in the mandibular arch, distance minimum vertical space of 8 mm between the tissue of floor of the mouth and the gingival margin of the teeth. This distance should be 8 mm for using the lingual bar as a major connector in the mandibular arch. Another point, we are doing the rules for using the major connector. Now another point is anterior border. Anterior border of the major connector should end in the valley. Should end in the valley between the rugae crust and not on the crust. Suppose this is the anterior border. This is the anterior border of the maxillary major connector, and the anterior border should end in the valley. This is the rugae. This is the rugae. Suppose this is the rugae. In the anterior hard palate, there is a presence of rugae. Suppose this is the rugae present, and this is the border of the major connector. This major connector should end in the valley area. Valley is between the two rugae. Between the two rugae, there is a valley, and it should not end on the crust. Where is the crust? This is the crust. The maxillary major connector should not end here. It should end in the valley between the rugae. This is the anterior border and the posterior border. Posterior limit is just anterior to the vibrating line. This is the posterior limit. This is the anterior limit. Anterior limit should end in the valley between the rugae and not on the crust. And the posterior limit just anterior to the vibrating line. This is the vibrating line or posterior palatal seal, and the posterior limit of the maxillary major connector, it should just anterior to the vibrating line. Another point, repair of the fracture major connector is contraindicated, and the denture should be remade. If the maxillary major connector, this is the major connector, it is fractured, repair is contraindicated. It should be remade. And the cobalt chrome alloy is best suited for the major connector. Why? Because of its excellent rigidity. I have explained in the first point that maxillary major connector should be rigid, and the cobalt chrome alloy is best suited for the major connector. This is the cobalt chrome alloy, and it's best suited for the major connector because of its excellent rigidity in thinner section. Even in the thinner section, it is rigid. That's why cobalt chrome alloy is best suited for the major connector. And among gold alloy, if we use the gold alloy as the major connector, then we use the type 4 gold alloy are used for the RPD. Next point, beading of palatal major connector exclusive of the rugae area produce positive tissue contact. It means suppose this is the mucosa. Suppose this is the mucosa and this is the major connector. In the posterior border will do the, on the posterior limit, this is the posterior limit, we do the beading exclusive, not in the rugae area, but in the posterior area we do the beading, and it produces a positive tissue contact. It should contact the tissue. Positive tissue contact should be there, so that they prevent the food debris from collecting under the major connector. So it should not be more than 0.5 mm in width or depth, and the depth of this beading should be 0.5 mm. Depth of this beading should be 0.5 mm. Width or depth of this beading should be 0.5 mm. And the phonetics of the RPD is affected mostly by the major connector. So phonetic, this is the major connector, and the phonetics is majorly affected because of this major connector. And the posterior palatal seal is not required if base is made of metal. So posterior palatal seal, as we give in complete denture, we give the posterior palatal seal, but it is not required here, as the posterior limit is just anterior to the vibrating line. So posterior palatal seal is not required if base is made of metal. It is not required. And the relief, another point is relief must be routinely provided between the mandibular major connector and the soft tissue. So this is the mandibular major connector. And relief is must be routinely provided between the mandibular major connector and the soft tissue. Relief prevent the margins of the connector from lacerating the sensitive lingual mucosa during movement. Sensitive lingual mucosa from laceration during the movement. So relief is must in the mandibular major connector. And the amount of relief depend on the type of removable partial denture. And the amount of relief depend on the type of removable partial denture and the slope of lingual tissue. In the next lecture we'll do the various type of removable partial denture. So amount of relief is also depending on the type of removable partial denture, and relief is not routinely given. It is must in the mandibular major connector. This is the maxillary major connector. Relief is not routinely indicated for the palatal major connector or maxillary major connector, except in presence of hard median palatal raphe or torus. See, this is the torus. If torus is present, then the relief, and torus has to be covered with the maxillary major connector, then the relief is must. In case of hard median palatal raphe, then the relief is must. Otherwise, not routinely indicated in the maxillary or palatal major connector. And the relief is done with the 20 gauge wax. 20 gauge wax relief is given with a 20 gauge wax.